Good evening and happy Earth Day to everyone. This meeting will begin momentarily. Thank you for joining the City of Riverside Housing and Public Safety Updates and Environmental Justice Policies meeting. This is the virtual public scoping meeting. To join the meeting via phone, the information is presented on the screen. We have the English and Spanish call-in numbers. And for any additional project information, please visit the project website at riversideca.gov/housing update. Next slide. This will be the fourth public meeting for this project since we got started and kicked off in January. Thank you to everyone who has participated previously. Today's meeting is the official scoping meeting, as I mentioned, to kick off the CEQA process, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, which will be explained shortly. And I have just a few housekeeping slides to cover before the city officially welcomes everyone and we officially get the meeting started. My name is JC Lacey, project manager with Ariano Associates. We're running the logistics and some of the behind the scenes work that's involved today, including Q&A, which we'll go into. We have 2 hours, up to 2 hours scheduled for this session. Next slide, please. A few meeting details. Spanish interpretation is available if needed. If you will locate the icon at the bottom of your screen, there is a little circle with a grid, and this is for interpretation. So if you hit that, we'll have Spanish available for you. Optional to hear the interpreted language only. Just click mute to the original audio. Next slide, please. We also have closed captioning available. If you need closed captioning, it's available on the city's YouTube page. And the address is shown there. It's youtube.com/c/City of Riverside for closed captioning. Next slide, please. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the project website for future review. I mentioned the previous meetings, those are also on the project website for review. And as I mentioned before, this is the first virtual environmental focused public meeting. The next opportunity to participate will be when the draft EIR or Environmental Impact Report is released in the summer. Next slide, please. We have a question and answer period for any questions and comments. It's important, as we will discuss, to get your participation and your questions. The questions and comments will be addressed at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to enter them as we go. And thank you for showing respect for all and avoiding any language that may be offensive. Your questions will be visible by everyone. Next slide, please. There will also be an open discussion portion for those who want to participate in that way. And there is a hand raise function. If you will locate the hand raise feature, this is how you will be addressed and we know that you have a question. And if you're on the phone line, *9 is how you would activate that function manually through the phone. To lower your hand, if you click the hand raise symbol again, it will lower your hand. Next slide, please. And with that, we're going to get started, and I will bring on the city to give you your official welcome. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Matthew Taylor. I am the project manager for the City of Riverside for this project. I am a planner with the Community and Economic Development Department. And as JC mentioned in his introduction, this is the CEQA scoping meeting for the Housing and Public Safety Element Updates and Environmental Justice Policies project. I'm going to go over a little bit about what the project is and a few other things before I hand it over to our environmental team, who is going to take you through some background on the CEQA process and what we're going to be looking at as we do our environmental review. Just an overview of the agenda tonight. Again, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the meeting, the project, and introduce some of our team members who you'll hear from a little bit more later. We'll talk about what the purpose of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, is and what the scoping meeting is for. We'll give you kind of some background on the project and how we've got to where we are today. We're going to give you a summary of the environmental impact areas we're going to be taking a look at in depth in the environmental impact report that we will prepare for the project. We'll go over what that review process looks like in terms of timing and steps and opportunities to engage. We'll talk about next steps, and then we will enter our open discussion and comment period. So with that, can I have the next slide, please? So before we go any further, just wanted to let you know up front, here are some additional ways that you can get engaged with the project virtually and online. So the project website, riversideca.gov/housing update, is the central kind of clearinghouse for all of the project materials, documents, maps, frequently asked questions, and other useful links, recordings of previous meetings. This meeting will be uploaded to that page as well. So you can get kind of the full picture if you haven't been able to join us as of yet. Questions, comments, any kind of information that you may want or need, you can email me directly. That's my email address right there on the slide. There are some maps that you can look at in more detail if you're interested. At the links shown here, they are also linked on the project website. If you are not able to capture this, you can just go to the project webpage and you'll find links there. Not shown on the screen, but also available on the project website is the notice of preparation and initial study. Our environmental team will talk a little bit more about what those things are, but those are the kind of the first stage of documents to be released as part of the CEQA environmental review process. Those are up on the project website now. They're available for you to take a look at, read through, review, download if you like. And we are accepting comments on those documents until May 5th. So my contact information, again, is also on the project website and the environmental documents. If you want to submit a comment, you would do so directly to me. For future public meetings, we have just announced, as of today, we will be bringing the project to our City Council Housing and Homelessness Committee to give an overview of the project and to present some draft policies and actions relating to housing and environmental justice on Monday, May 3rd I'm sorry, it says 3:30 here, but that meeting is actually scheduled for 4:00 p.m. We'll update that in the project materials afterward. That is going to be the next public meeting for this project. Next slide, please. Okay, so to give you a little bit of background about why we're doing this project. So every 8 years, all cities and counties in the state are required to update their plans for how they're going to provide housing for all of their current and future residents. This process started several years ago with the state taking a look at expectations for population growth, employment growth, transportation planning, and a number of other factors to figure out how much housing do we actually need to provide over the next 8 years, right? You know, once that process had been completed, then there was a subsequent process that involved distributing the share of all of the housing that will be needed across the state through various regional organizations, and then on down to the city and county level. Once we have that allocation provided to us, we then have to go about a process of updating our plans to show how we will meet our requirements that we've been assigned in terms of the number of units and where they might go and how we will address things like affordable housing, fair housing, accessibility, environmental justice, and those topics. So we kicked this project off in late summer of last year, did a lot of background data gathering and analysis, prepared a few different plans and inventories of possible future locations for housing, and then began a process of public engagement early in 2021. We did a series of public workshops and are now at the stage where we need to begin the required California Environmental Quality Act review and environmental impact report of the project that we've developed. And that is where we are tonight. We are meeting with you to hear from you what you believe our environmental review document should focus on and examine, and what kinds of potential impacts and effects on the environment that this project could have that you think we need to address. The next steps are a couple of different things. One is a draft of our plan needs to be submitted to the state so that they can review it to ensure that it meets their requirements and their expectations, and it hits all of the points that our housing plan needs to hit. Simultaneously, we will be preparing the environmental impact report, as we've mentioned. Deborah's going to talk a little bit more about what exactly that is and what that process looks like in just a few moments. Following that process, we will be bringing this project, including our plan for housing, our updates to our public safety plans, and our environmental justice work back to the city decision makers, including the Planning Commission and the City Council, for formal consideration and adoption. We do have to have this project done by October 15th in order to meet a mandatory deadline that we cannot miss. So we are moving very quickly, and we need as much public input as we can, as early in the process as possible, so that we can make sure that we stay on track to meet that deadline. Next slide, please. All right, so what is a general plan and what is this project's relationship to it? So the general plan is every city and county must have a long-term kind of roadmap for how it's going to grow and develop over a period of time. The general plan has to address a number of key areas, which are called elements. So when you hear the term housing element, public safety element, those are the essentially chapters of the general plan that deal with a topic area. And those cover all kinds of things: housing, land use, transportation, infrastructure, education, a number of different things. Right now, we're focused on the housing element, the public safety element, and another newer component, which is the environmental justice policies piece. There are other elements of the general plan which we will also be updating, but that will be in a second phase of this project, which we hope to have kicked off later this year. These elements or chapters just establish what the city's broad goals are for how it's going to grow and develop in these various areas over a certain period of time. And it lays out policies about, that we're going to take to get there, and what specific actions or steps we're going to take to make that a reality. And again, environmental justice policies are now required to be included in general plans. So those are something that we're incorporating as well. So it's an update of the housing element and public safety elements, which already exist, and the incorporation of environmental justice policies, which will be new to the general plan. Next slide, please. All right, so the objectives of this meeting, which Deborah's going to get into in more detail in just a moment, is to provide you an introduction to the CEQA process and why we're meeting tonight and what we're doing. We're going to summarize what the proposed project is from an environmental perspective, and share a little bit about what CEQA work we have done on the project to date. And then finally, we're requesting your input about what should the environmental impact report we prepare for this project examine, and what are the next steps, and how do you stay engaged and involved. I do want to take a moment to briefly introduce some of the folks that are with us here tonight. So the city has assembled a team of experts to help us with this project. We've already met JC with Ariano and Associates, who is helping us with all of our outreach and engagement work, including facilitating our public meetings such as this. We also have Robert Kane with Housio Levine Associates. They are our planning and urban design consultant, and they are the lead consultant on the project. And then tonight's star is ICF, which is our environmental consultant. And they're represented tonight by Deborah Light and Allison Rondoni, who are kind of the leads on writing guiding the CEQA process along and writing the documents and the analysis. We also have Veronica Tam, who is our expert housing consultant. So she is advising us on how we can meet the state's requirements and make sure that the document and the plan that we produce meets all of its expectations under state law. So with that, I think we have the next slide, please. Okay, that about does it for me until you'll see me again when we do the Q&A portion. I may jump in here and there as Deborah goes through her presentation, but right now I'm going to hand it to Deborah Light, who is going to introduce CEQA and the environmental impact report and tell you a little bit more about the project and the CEQA process. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, and happy Earth Day to everybody. Today marks the 51st anniversary of Earth Day, and today's Earth Day theme is Restore Our Earth, which focuses on natural processes and energy efficiencies that can restore the world's ecosystem. So I just want to say thank you for sharing your Earth Day with us tonight. You know, your time is very valuable, and so we definitely appreciate you spending the time with us and also providing the input that you will hopefully provide at the end of this meeting. Next slide. This slide introduces CEQA's main purpose, which is to inform the public and decision makers, including other agencies, about a project and the environmental impacts that could result with its implementation. The environmental documents that will be prepared as a part of CEQA for this project, including an initial study and a notice of preparation, which Matthew just talked about, those documents have been prepared. They are available online, and the project website contains a lot of that information, and a lot of that information will be summarized today. So those are two documents that have been prepared to date. An initial study is just a preliminary evaluation of what the project impacts are. So there are a number of questions that CEQA produces, and the initial study will go into detail about what those questions are, and our job is to evaluate the project against those questions. And the notice of preparation is really more informative. It talks about what the project is. It gives you some insight as to what the environmental process will be. It gives you important dates. It introduces you to the project, but it also lets you know of the city's intent to produce an environmental impact report or an EIR, which is sort of the next phase of this project. And, you know, CEQA's main goal is really just to disclose environmental impacts. You know, we will identify what the impacts of the project are, as well as ways to avoid or reduce impacts and any recommended mitigation measure or project alternatives that could reduce those environmental impacts. But really, one of the most important aspects of CEQA is the opportunity it gives to the public and the agencies and any important city stakeholder to give them that opportunity for input and to comment into the environmental review process. So at the end of this presentation tonight, we will be asking for your comments to help you, to help us complete the draft EIR we're currently preparing. So that input is really, really critical to the development of the document, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. So next slide, please. So many people might not have heard of the term scoping meeting. So I think it's really important for us to develop up front what is the purpose of tonight's meeting. It's really to notify the public, to notify you that the city has intended to prepare an environmental impact report. And the notice of preparation really outlines that intent as well. And so the project that we're evaluating here is the Riverside Housing and Public Safety Elements Update and the environmental justice policies that will be included within each of those updates. And so that collectively is called our proposed project. We are also providing critical information about the project to help you understand the project that we're currently evaluating as a part of the EIR. We're also planning to identify what those potential environmental issues are. So really, what are the expectations to when you will have an EIR to review, which will be a little later on, and we'll talk about schedule later. But it's really just important for us to receive your input. We need to understand your perspective. And this is an important step in the CEQA process where we're scoping out the issues. We're getting information and feedback from those who are maybe understand the project better because you're living there, because you're living in neighborhoods. So it's just really critical that we include your input in this process. And tonight's meeting, that's its critical intent. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about what CEQA is and what our next steps are, is really just to talk about what the project is. So now I'm going to follow up with some additional slides about what our project is. Next slide. So I think we all know pretty well what is the full extent of the city. So I just wanted to include some background for those who might not be familiar. And really just to provide a point of reference. So the project includes all of the areas within the city of Riverside's corporate boundaries as well as its sphere of influence. So the total planning area for the city encompasses about 92,000 gross acres. It's a large area of evaluation, and so the evaluation in of itself will be at a programmatic level. So we're going to be looking at the entirety of the city as well as the opportunity sites that we'll talk about a little bit later in various scales, but we wanted to, at least as a point of reference, provide this map so that way it's understood what area we're looking into. Next slide, please. As we stated previously, CEQA requires a project be evaluated to determine its potential environmental impacts. So the housing and public safety elements and the distinct components within them, like general plan amendments or zoning code updates or specific plan amendments, as well as the addition of environmental justice policies, which is new to the general plan, its implementation could result in significant environmental effects. So implementation of the project could also result in up to 30,190 dwelling units throughout the city. And this new growth could also result in impacts. That is what we'll be disclosing as a part of the program EIR. So we wanted to at least lay out the major project components here in this map. So it's just kind of a nice quick reference, but also just let you know of the numbers. And so we'll talk a little bit later about what those numbers are. Next slide. A requirement for EIRs is to have a set of project objectives. These objectives are also currently in the NOP, the Notice of Preparation, so you can definitely look at those and review them there. It's a lot of words, but there are a lot of key project alternatives or project objectives here that we really want to relay to the team, to the people here, so that way it's understood what the intent of the project is and how these relate to the project objectives. So one key objective for the project is to meet the city's obligation to include 24,000 new housing units, which is required to meet the city's regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA is the common term that you'll hear today and the one that is much easier for us to say. So the RHNA allocation is, we'll talk about those a little bit more because numbers are really important. But for just having the basic objectives, we just want to make sure it's understood that there's a requirement and it's our objective to meet that requirement through this project. Objectives also include ensuring affordable and other housing types are added throughout the city and in areas with accessibility to services and other city amenities, and not in areas with restrictions like development constraints or areas used for agricultural or conservation, or in, say, high fire or flooding risk areas. So we made a concerted effort to understand the site conditions before we identified these project sites for housing. Another objective relates to addressing public safety and public health needs, and really to be proactive in the protection of natural and human-caused hazards. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides will talk a little bit more about the housing element and really provides an assessment of the city's housing needs. It also includes a minimum number of dwelling units plus a buffer to ensure that the city meets its housing obligation. For this housing element update, it will cover a minimum housing need of 18,458 dwelling units plus an added buffer. The city's planning for an even larger buffer of about 31,900 dwelling units to ensure that the city meets its RHNA obligation by 2029 for the 8-year period of the housing element update. The State Housing and Community Department, or HCD, you might hear that term, will review and ultimately comment and approve of the housing element, and the deadline for this next cycle is October 15, 2021. Next slide. So this slide is all about the numbers. From the previous slide, we saw that the minimum housing need is 18,458. And then we have a 30% buffer, which gives us a housing need of 24,000. So that's really the absolute amount that is required of the housing element. But because the city wanted to be really just have more opportunity for additional growth and to have an even larger buffer, that's where the 31,900 dwelling units comes from. So what we'll be doing, because the project in and of itself is really a large and confusing project, but we're trying to make sure through the information that you see in the NOP and what you'll see eventually in the EIR will outline a lot of these numbers in a little bit clearer way so it's understood. But because we need to evaluate worst case condition for CEQA impacts, we will evaluate development of up to 31,900 dwelling units. So that's what the analysis you'll find in the initial study contains, as well as what you'll find in the EIR. So just wanted to make sure that these numbers are understood a little bit, and feel free to ask a little bit of those questions to our team as they've developed those sites a little bit more clearer. Next slide, please. The updated housing element must show the locations where future housing can be built, and it must identify the potential number of homes that can be built at those locations. This map shows the location of opportunity sites and also additional sites that are proposed for rezoning. Note that not all of these sites will be rezoned, so it's a combination of different sites, and we have a multitude of maps in the notice of preparation that gives you much more information than we can convey here today. But please do take the time and download those so that way you can see the different types of maps that have been created, including, what are the opportunity sites, that require zoning and which ones won't. And so it's very informative and includes a lot of really good information. These sites are all found within each of the 7 wards throughout the city. And it also will be within 7 distinct specific plans within the city, including downtown and Magnolia Avenue, just to name a couple of those. With implementation of the sites, the potential full build out, at least the capacity for potential new housing, will be 31,900 dwelling units, which is what we'll be evaluating in the EIR as full build out. It's not necessarily the same number that is going to be the RHNA allocation or that will be in the housing element. It's a distinction that we just need to make sure is clear, but we also know that the potential for additional housing could result in that much development, so we want to make sure that that's clear. Next slide. So these are the known constraints in the city that were developed as a part of the identification for the opportunity sites. So we wanted to get a good understanding of where these constraints are, so that way when we develop those opportunity sites, we weren't going to put housing in places where it might have a high fire risk or that might be in a flood zone. There's also some areas of conservation that are pretty key to the city, so those sites are not included in those. So those opportunity sites were developed and we talked about them in previous meetings. So I just want to make sure it was clear that, there was a lot of information that came into developing these opportunity sites. And so this map just shows those constraints that went into that development. Next slide. So the housing element is still being drafted. There's still some work for us to do, but this lists some of the ways that the city hopes to meet its RHNA allocation. It's really through protections for tenants, rehabilitation of affordable units, maybe fewer development restrictions, changes in zoning, and solutions like density transfer or in lieu fees. So all of these can be policies and actions that will be found in the housing element. So just wanted to give you a heads up of this content. Next slide. The next major project component is the public safety element. And so as a part of the project, it will be updated, especially as there's been some recent legislation that, like a Senate Bill 1035 that requires the public safety element to be updated along with the housing element to address issues like flood and fire hazards. And another Senate bill is 379 that requires that the public safety element address climate adaptation and resiliency strategies, among other environmental issues. So the public safety element, which is a requirement of the city's general plan, as we talked about before, will help guide local decisions related to zoning and development regulations. Next slide. The public safety element will identify various forms of public safety hazards, including fire and flood hazards, transportation hazards, geologic conditions like earthquakes or liquefaction or landslides, emergency services, climate change, and even pandemic preparedness and response. Just like this year that we've had, there's been just so many of these things have happened over the course of the past year, including wildfires that have affected Southern California. So those are all key issues that are discussed in the public safety element. And so we will be addressing those issues and developing policies related to them. And these policies will include methods of minimizing risk as well as ways to minimize economic disruption or even speeding up recovery following disasters or other public safety incidences. The new environmental justice policies will also be included in this update. Next slide. This update to both the housing and public safety elements will require new environmental justice policies. Sometimes shortened to EJ, the definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful input of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the environmental laws, regulations, and policies. As a part of the project, environmental justice policies will be developed for both the housing and public safety elements. And this is a new general plan requirement. These policies will address the disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental impacts that could occur on minority and low-income populations more than, say, other populations. These policies will also address issues related to public and environmental health, pollution and climate change, social equity, and even access to resources and city amenities. Next slide. Now that we've summarized the project to be evaluated through CEQA, we will now look at the potential environmental impacts that will be addressed in the EIR. Next slide. This right here is a comprehensive list of all of the environmental topics that are typically considered in environmental documents like initial studies and EIRs. These topics were disclosed in the initial study that is currently available on the project website. The environmental review process is required to evaluate all of these topics, and the public can comment on the project and this list of topics throughout the CEQA process. Mostly, it's preferred that the discussion of these comments are provided during key times in the schedule. Like right now, we're in the middle of a 30-day public review. And then when the draft EIR is released, that'll be a 45-day public review, but also you can provide comments throughout the process during these meetings and workshops that are being scheduled. But one of the key intents of today's meeting is really to get comments on really any of these topics. And so just to provide some background, since the initial study is out and available for public review, it includes distinct questions, CEQA threshold questions is what we're called, related to each of these environmental topics. And so some of these questions will have, some of these topics will have multiple questions, sometimes only 2, sometimes they could have up to 6 or 7 or 8. And they will ask a series of questions like, will the project generate greenhouse gas emissions? Or will the project conflict with land use plans and policies? So those are just a couple of the examples of the types of questions you will find in the initial study related to these environmental topics. Next slide. Through the evaluation conducted as a part of that initial study, we evaluated these topics against the proposed project. And so these topics here were reviewed for potential project impacts, and these were determined to have less than significant impacts. The details for these findings are provided in the initial study, but the discussion of these topics will also be included in the draft EIR as a section called Effects Not Found Significant. So they will be summarized there, and the reasons for these conclusions will also be included in actually both the initial study and the environmental impact report. Next slide. This list of environmental topics will be also evaluated in the draft EIR, but in greater detail, as there is a potential that significant impacts could occur as a result of the project. So technical reports and analyses are currently being prepared for these topics, with the results to be included in the draft EIR once it is released. Data is being collected now, and results are being modeled for topics like transportation, air quality, and noise, based on land use changes anticipated with full build out of the RHNA allocation currently within the housing element. Next slide. This slide includes a list of the CEQA alternatives that are currently being considered for the EIR. CEQA does require that a reasonable range of feasible alternatives are included, even alternatives to the project that would result in the project not being approved, called the no project alternative. And that particular alternative would assume that there would be no change in zoning or no new development of the opportunity sites. Of course, this would also not meet the project objectives, and it wouldn't meet the RHNA goal. But this particular alternative is required by law to be evaluated in the EIR. So you'll have a comparison of what the project impacts are in comparison to not doing the project at all. Also, during development of the preferred alternative from previous information meetings that we've had, we discussed alternatives for dispersed and focused growth as the potential project. And through that process, the project was considered because it sort of combined those two to create something that would just make the most sense based on our review of all of those factors. But we also will evaluate, the impacts of those two alternatives to the project, really for comparative purposes. The last alternative we are considering is a reduction in the opportunity sites that really just hits the mark for RHNA allocation, but it doesn't give as much flexibility as the proposed project. The alternatives analysis will evaluate the potentially significant environmental impacts from all of those topics that we saw on the previous slide. And so those same topics will be evaluated for the alternative. So, the project evaluated in detail, traffic and transportation, we will also be evaluating that key topic here for the alternatives. Next slide. Now that we know the topics that we'll see in the EIR, we will also talk about the EIR process and what that will look like. Next slide. This flow chart shows the steps for the environmental review process to get us to the end of the CEQA process. We are here right now in the public scoping meeting, so you can see that in that orange color. So it's sort of really early on in the process. There are still a lot of steps that we need to do. The notice of preparation and initial study for the project have been completed, so those are documents that are currently available online. Today we've summarized the results of that review, but you can look through those documents to get much more information and content about that. So please do take a look at that. It's on the city's website. And really the next step is to take those comments that we hear today, as well as those written comments that are provided on those documents during this 30-day public review period. And then we will complete the EIR based on the work we are currently doing, as well as the comments that we will be receiving as a part of the process. The draft EIR is a larger document than this initial study, so it will require an even larger 45-day public review period. So that gives us a lot of time for review of probably a good sized document. During that review, we will also have another public meeting to take additional comments on the results of the environmental analysis. So that meeting, we will talk more thoroughly about what the impacts are maybe discuss those alternatives as well as mitigation and any other measures that are included in the process. So there'll be a lot of information to be provided at that next CEQA meeting. The final step will be to take the comments on the draft EIR that is anticipated to be released in the summer and provide formal comments and responses to those, and we will be addressing those in a final EIR. Our goal is to complete the EIR process in October of this year, really to meet timeframes for the housing element approval. So there's a lot of work we're doing, and definitely appreciate your time in developing comments that will help support this process. Next slide. This slide is like the previous one, but instead highlights future, next steps are coming up. So here we go. Our next steps are really a bunch of dates, a bunch of other things. This is very similar to the previous slide, but really just highlights them in different colors for those who might want to see it in a different way. What's really important here is that dates in orange are opportunities for input, and dates in blue are the distinct dates. So we're currently in a 30-day public review period, and you can provide formal written comments between now and May 5th. So it's an important date to keep in mind. And then of course, today is our scoping meeting. We are partway through this process, and we've already completed certain steps like the NOP and the initial study. So our current next step is to take those comments and put them and understand them and then put them into the draft EIR, utilizing the information that we're getting as a part of this process. But really, it's just important to note that, you know, this process is collaborative. It involves multiple stakeholders, including the public, including other agencies and other departments of the city. So it's really important that we provide this opportunity as early and as often in this process. Next slide. So the project team is also working collaboratively to develop draft versions of the housing element and public safety element, as we talked before, as well as those environmental justice policies contained within each of those two documents. We will continue to provide opportunities to review these documents as they become available as a part of the overall project update. So please check the project website and emails providing dates for future meetings often, because there'll be some great information and content provided then when these documents will be available for review. Next slide. So as a part of the scoping meeting, it's very important for us to just provide this opportunity for comment. And so what types of comments are we looking for? This is the type of information we're really seeking today. So what we need from you is an understanding of what conditions the city has and what is sort of your understanding of your environment. And how does that understanding, how does that add to the overall understanding to us? Is that we need to know from your perspective what life is like for you and what we can do to have a better understanding of the types of impacts that you might have on a day-to-day basis, or the types of impacts that could result when these projects are developed. So it's important for us to know, what are these opportunity sites? Are they in your neighborhood? How do they how do you perceive what these impacts would be? Do those impacts relate to any of those other topics that are discussed? Are there any other projects that are happening in that area that we should know about? Do you have any insight on what measures might work to avoid or minimize any of those impacts? And really, are there any alternatives we haven't considered that maybe we should? So really, we just want to know, what environmental concerns you have related to this process, and also, what impacts, or what do you think about the impacts that are disclosed in documents that are currently available? So it's really important we get your input. And here are some of the items that we think are critical to the success of understanding the impacts from your perspective, so that way we can disclose them in the EIR. Next slide. So besides providing comments that you can provide via email or snail mail, because that's still out there. But I know a lot of times it's much easier to do them via email. There is a great opportunity today to provide your comments verbally during the meeting, so please do raise your hand. We also have an opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function, not the chat function. So I think that's a mistake on the slide, but for the Q&A function. So I think there's been some questions already that have been put up, but please do provide your input in these three ways, either verbally today, through the Q&A function, or via mail. And just note, a very important date here is that the comment period does close on May 5th. We have to close the comment period so that way we can get to work to address a lot of those comments and to get an understanding of them. Next slide. So now we're at the point where your input is very important, and I will relay this over to Matthew.
All right, thank you so much, Deborah, for that. We are going to get into questions and answers and also comments and discussion now. Really quick before we jump into that, I do want to take a moment to just reiterate the various numbers that you have heard, because I understand that they may be a little bit confusing because there's several different numbers flying around in terms of the number of units. So the RHNA obligation of 18,458 is a bare minimum amount assigned to the city by the state that we have to show that we can accommodate. 24,000 is our goal with this project, because that provides not only enough units to meet our minimum, but also a buffer in order to ensure that if some of the sites that we've identified do not develop with housing like we expect them to, or they don't develop with as much housing as we expect them to, we have backups. And that's where that number comes from. And then finally, the EIR is going to be examining the potential impacts of adding up to about 32,000 new units. And that is because the EIR, as Deborah mentioned earlier, must address the worst case scenario. Now, that is if every opportunity site that we have identified is developed with the maximum number of units that could possibly be built on it. This is a highly unrealistic scenario. We have very little to no reason to expect that will ever happen, but the law says that we have to analyze it. So that is why you're hearing those three different numbers in terms of the number of units. I also do want to add that the housing element and RHNA does not require that the city guarantee that any of these units are built. It does require that we make the sites available and make the process available for these units to develop. So that's a key distinction there. It does not mean if we have identified an opportunity site that we will be building housing on it. It's really left to the market to determine which sites, if will develop with housing. Our job is to facilitate and to show through our housing element update that we can facilitate the number of units, at least the minimum number of units that were assigned. So those are just some clarifications that I wanted to put out there for everybody. So first thing I want to do with questions and answers is some quick housekeeping questions that came up during the presentation. I want to address those really quickly. And then we have some hands raised. We also have some chat questions coming in. So I'm going to try my best to take those in the order that they are received. All right. So Maribel asked during the presentation, can we get a number of people that are on the call? Yes, in terms of audience members, when that question was asked, we had 41 participants. It's dropped down a little bit to 39 at this point. It has fluctuated a little bit, but we have around 40 people with us here tonight, not including the panelists and the project team. Christine made a comment that the link doesn't work to open the map. We have noticed this. Thank you for pointing out to us. There was evidently some kind of issue with the server today for the static version of the map, the PDF map of the opportunity sites that was both shown earlier and is available on the project's site. So the 3D web map should still be working if you want to use that. but the static PDF map did have to be relocated. We will update the project website to fix that link. Connie asks, the RENA allocation slide, are these income levels? Yes, so that slide did show the number of units that we need to provide at various income levels. We can talk a little bit more about that in detail, but yes, 30, 50, 80% of area median income, those are the various income levels that we have to plan for. Todd and Connie both asked, can we get a copy of this presentation? Will it be made available on the city's website? Yes, absolutely. We will post this and the video on the city's website within a couple of days of the meeting. Sometimes it takes a little while, particularly for video recordings, but we will be uploading this to the resources tab of the project website. So please do check there. Okay, so I do want to call on Miss Rose Mays, very first hand we had up today. Ariano team, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Ms. Mays can unmute herself now and make her comment or ask her question.
Correct.
Well, thank you so very much for recognizing me that, but I was just concerned because, as you know, Fair Housing Council of Riverside County has been servicing the county and especially the city of Riverside for over 30 years. And some of the issues that have been addressed for many, many years. I wanted to ask you about, because I know that now the city of Riverside is just about landlocked. Are you all thinking about doing any accumulating property in the county service area? What are you going to do is, and I know that you're going to do the houses where you have homes that have been torn down, infills, you're going to do that. But I just don't see how that you're going to meet the demand. And that is the number one issue that we have is affordable housing. So unless you are going to annex property from the county, how are we going to meet the goals of for the public here in Riverside, the city of Riverside?
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. That's been a question that's come up a couple of times. One thing that I do want to add is the opportunity sites that we've identified are not the only locations that housing development can take place. There is still land throughout the city that is zoned for all types of housing. They have not been necessarily identified as opportunity sites as part of this project for a variety of reasons. One being maybe we don't, it does not seem likely that they will develop within the 8-year planning period that we're dealing with. The other is, maybe they're a little bit far from services or infrastructure that might need to be extended to them. And so that does not necessarily mean that housing cannot be built there, but that the fact that they may be far from those kinds of things does not meet the state's criteria for what they consider an adequate site. These opportunity sites that we've identified are not the only locations where housing development can occur. They're just the inventory that we are presenting to the state as what we think are the best opportunity sites for new housing. Annexation is tricky because for a couple of reasons. One, there is a factor of if you annex unincorporated territory from the county, that could affect our RENA allocation in that, we would potentially have to absorb some of the housing need from the county because the county has its own assigned number of housing units that it has to provide. We may absorb some portion of that, which would just increase our number. The other issue, of course, with annexation is, expanding the city's service territories does come with significant burdens on city services, which can already be challenged, and so the cost of extending services to these areas may not necessarily counterbalance the value of adding new territory to the city, especially if it's in outlying areas where there may not be a lot of infrastructure and there may not be a lot of existing services. And so we would have to potentially undertake significant expense to extend things in those directions. So I hope that kind of starts to answer your question. Again, like I said, the opportunity sites are not the only locations that housing development can occur. There will continue to be lots of other property throughout the city where housing development can occur of all kinds, whether it's multifamily development, it's single family development, it's condominium, it's ownership, it's rental. Everything is on the table.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you, Ms.
Anything we
Nance.
can do, let us know.
Okay, great. Okay. I'm going to switch back and forth between hands and written comments. So next we have a question from Adriana. She asks, will the EIR measure impacts on vehicle miles traveled? VMT has a major impact on carbon emissions and air pollution. And I want to hand this to the ICF team, the environmental folks, to answer this question.
Yes, VMT or vehicle miles traveled will be a key determinant in the analysis for transportation impacts. And there is a traffic consultant who's currently working on that analysis right now using the land use data associated with the inventory. So that should be provided in the draft EIR when that will be released in the summer.
All right, great, thank you. Switching back to hands, next we have Ms. Nancy Hart with her hand raised. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Ms. Hart, and speak your mind. It does look like you're still muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Yes, that was not showing earlier. My comment is mostly on parking. I have been involved in major housing development projects over the last few years, and I also live in the area of where some of these were built, and I have no problem with them being built. I have no problem with the densities. What I have problem with is parking. And there was some underground parking put in with the project, but because of the cost of underground parking or the cost of the tenant not wanting to pay for parking, is parking on the street. And the streets are fairly wide, but they also inhibit regular everyday traffic because at the end of the day or the late afternoon, traffic is awful because people are parking. And so my problem is, or my comment is just to really, the city has done a bad job of providing parking for the projects that they've done. So if that needs to be a bigger topic in the whole idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And just to add to that, Ms. Hart, for those of you who don't know, Ms. Hart is a former council member for the city of Riverside, so we thank you for taking the time to be here tonight. If you have suggestions for us to consider about strategies that you think that we might look at in order to help with that issue, we would definitely appreciate your input. So thank you so much for being here. Okay, I'm going to switch back now to written questions. So from Tom, we have, just to confirm, the Northside specific plan is not included in your EIR. That is a separate EIR. Yes, that is correct. So the Northside specific plan was completed, including an EIR for that project, and adopted in November, December of 2020. I do want to point out that there are opportunity sites that were identified in the Northside specific plan area, but none of those are proposed for rezoning. Those have already been zoned for additional housing as part of the Northside specific plan. And so we are not proposing to change or revisit that as part of this project. What we are proposing to do is include them in our list of potential opportunity sites because they are already set up for additional housing. And it just makes sense for us to make sure that we get whatever kind of credit for that we can. And then I don't know if ICFU wanted to add anything about how previous EIRs like kind of inform what we're doing now.
We can incorporate some of that content by reference, but we don't want to double count impacts. So that other EIR evaluated Northside specific plan impacts. So we could utilize some of that content in our document and reference it and even have it be one of the sources that are used for the analysis, but we don't have to double count the impacts in our document because it's already been completed.
All right, thank you. Switching back now to hands raised, we have Adriana. So Adriana, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to comment that I live in the university area, and I'm wondering whether the UCR's plans to basically double its student body by 2035 are going to be taken into consideration for this plan. I think it's really important that housing production in the university area keep up with that growth in order to make sure that the neighborhood remains affordable to students and university employees. Thanks.
All right, yeah, thank you. So a couple of things about the university and student housing that I want to touch on just briefly. One is, many of you may know this, but the University of California, Riverside is outside of the jurisdiction of the city. So we don't get to control anything that they do on their campus. We are able to set land use policies and regulations for everything surrounding. We do have to kind of navigate that relationship as we do this kind of planning work. Another thing is that student housing generally, depending on how it's configured, some of it can count towards our RHNA obligations, but some of it does not. There is, sort of some of the plans that the university has to construct additional housing on their campus, could contribute to us meeting our goals, but not all of it. I will point out as well that our opportunity sites, there are a number of opportunity sites for more, higher density mixed use kind of urban development in and around the university to support exactly that kind of, neighborhood that you describe. And there's also an opportunity to look at how we might use policies to ensure that the neighborhood does remain affordable and accessible to the student body as well. So I thank you for that, Adriana.
Thanks. Hope those sites, hope that works out.
Thank you. Okay. Another written question from Tom. Ward 1 has about 33% of the housing units, almost 10,000 units. Have you spoke with RUSD on the impact to schools and environmental justice areas? So the short answer is yes. The school districts and private and charter schools are important stakeholders in this process. And then they're involved in the review of all of the environmental documents. Our process will inform their facilities analysis that they propose. So there is an important kind of relationship there. We have met with RUSD particularly to talk about exactly what kind of, potential impacts the project might have on their student body and their facilities. But I do want to actually ask ICF to talk a little bit about what that EIR will analyze and as it relates to schools.
So one of the CEQA threshold questions actually relates to public services and the impacts that a project could have on schools. So that is a particular question that will be evaluated in the EIR. So we will be discussing, what the population increase could be with implementation of the project and what that could mean in terms of impacts to schools. So that will be information that will be found in the draft EIR.
All right, thank you, Deborah. Okay, next hand up, we have Janet. So Janet, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi, good evening. My name is Janet Bernabe. I'm the organizing director for the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. And my question is, what policies currently exist that address environmental issues, particularly related to air and water quality in disadvantaged communities?
All right, thank you. So I'll start by saying that, again, environmental justice is relatively new to the general plan. So in terms of policies that are specifically designed to address these issues for disadvantaged or environmental justice communities, however you prefer to refer to them, are not necessarily reflected in our current general plan. Now, we do have policies related to both of those things, but they were not necessarily developed with the goal of addressing the needs of environmental justice communities. So that is something that we will be developing through this process, and we would encourage you to stay engaged as we announce a series of workshops to talk specifically about policies, and I'll share a little bit more about that when we wrap up for the evening. But that's an important piece of this project, is making sure that we update those policies and those actions in order to address the needs of those communities. And then Deborah, I don't know if you wanted to share a little bit about the analysis that and the inventory of policies that we're preparing and what kind of that looks like and what that means for our project.
Sure. So environmental justice is not actually a CEQA threshold question. So it's not a requirement that EJ populations are included. However, we will be disclosing impacts to communities in the city as it relates to air quality, hazards, climate change, noise, access to resources like recreational facilities. So those are key items that will be evaluated in our EIR. We'll also talk about what the land use impacts are to communities in the city based on what the project is. So we will be evaluating what the community impacts are related to the project. So just be on the lookout for the draft EIR, which will include that information.
All right. So our next written question is from Tom, and it has to do with the previous RHNA cycle and the goals and outcomes for that cycle. But I do want to ask if Veronica Tam, who has been preparing an analysis of our progress, can talk to this, but I do want to come back to that question to give her a moment to review those materials. So we will come back to that question from Tom. The next question is from Adam. Are there any elected officials or city staff here? So we do have city staff present. There are myself, Principal Planner Dave Murray, Michelle Davis, who is the Housing Authority Manager, is with us today. I am not certain about the elected officials. They are welcome to join us for these meetings, but in terms of the core project team as the panelists, that's who you have with you from the city today. Also Riverside TV, thanks for facilitating our live stream. Okay, Veronica, are you able to just come back to the question about what was the last RHNA cycle's goals and what were our results in terms of production?
Yes, give me 5 more minutes. I'm pulling the right report right now. So
okay, so let's go to question from Miguel with a raised hand.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Hopefully my phone won't die, so no battery. But anyway, thank you so much, Matthew. This is Miguel Vasquez with the Riverside University Health System Public Health. And we will be submitting written comments, but I wanted to zoom in. I wanted to take the opportunity to zoom in on the environmental justice piece. I know that this is very new and there is no previous precedents to be able to actually replicate something that has been done. So in a sense, you will be pioneering. And because of that, I wanted to give you some recommendations to consider. So yes, while CEQA does not ask for or gives you the ability to evaluate environmental justice as part of an environmental study or an EIR, there is one particular section, the other section. And I think you could use that section to include environmental justice. Now, from the point of view of our agency, environmental justice, and given the actual name of the act, which is the Healthy Communities Act, we like to be able for this document to study public health outcomes. And obviously, as stated by SB 1000, what they mean. I understand that there's guidelines from OPR, from the Office of Planning and Research, and also that there is a toolkit that provides a number of recommendations for what to include as part of an environmental justice requirement. I think it would be important to first study what the issues are before using the menu of recommendations that are in existence. I think in a nutshell, I would like to recommend that the EIR incorporates a health impact assessment. I think this scoping session is already part of that. So that is my comment. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Matthew,
Yes.
are you ready for the numbers?
Yeah, go ahead, Veronica.
Okay.
This is back to Tom's question about the previous RENA cycle and our
Right.
progress.
Yeah, the previous RENA for the city of Riverside was 8,283 units. It's broken down into income categories. Certainly, majority of that, about I can even share the a screen for the numbers, but I think it's I don't want to tackle too much. But essentially, the city's been able to build about 5,000 and more than 5,000 units. A majority of that, it is in the above moderate income, because when market rate housing is developed at market, they are typically not affordable to lower income households. But the city was able to provide some housing for lower and moderate income households. I think it's a little bit less than 400 units, unfortunately, of lower income households. The majority of the units were for above moderate income.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that was a couple of written questions. So I want to go back now to hands raised, and we have Ms. Rose Mays. Once again, please unmute yourself and let us.
No, I don't have a question. I'm okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. Let's move then to Maribel with your hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I think that, with comparing the fifth cycle and the sixth cycle, I think we appreciate finding new areas to add in the RENA numbers. The north side, from what I understand, is an add-on, and the Canyon Crest. So that's great. And adding a lot of mixed use zoning, that's been great. I wanted to ask, with Ward 4, I do want to reiterate that we definitely would appreciate if more zoning could be going for the arena numbers that don't include projecting within the ADU units. So that's something that we're going to continue asking for, that it doesn't project those potential ADU units that are trying to find rezoning within Ward 4. I mean, there's already like a low number, and then ADU units is not really, I don't think it's the way to go. And then in the policy recommendations, I think that I saw in one of the initial slides, but in the housing element and EJ, is just if there's could be potentially funds that maybe we can look at within the city for transportation, to have more transportation corridors across the state. So I think that might go under policy recommendation, city funds, Measure Z, or what have you, that could allow some flexibility for more funding. That money could go to RTA, so that there's more bus stops, and then we from there have more transportation corridors across. So we don't have just transportation corridors in certain parts of the city, which don't allow us to add more different RENA numbers like we had faced in Ward 4. And then I think we, there's other policies in regards to, I think it's SB 330 that deals with overriding, not overriding, but just how we can think about ways to deal with local measures. So I think that's something for us that we're going to bring up in upcoming meetings. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. Looking for city funds as a policy recommendation bucket, so that we could put more bus stops in the different parts of the city. So thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. And public transportation access is going to be part of the transportation impact analysis that we do in the environmental impact report. So thank you for that, Maribel. Okay. Okay, we have a written question from Janet. I have lived on Palm Avenue and Beechwood Place for some time. As a stakeholder in this collaborative project, I'm wondering why such a large percentage of the planned units are within the CEQA are planned in Ward 1, and specifically the Wood Street Grand Avenue area. There has continued to be a depression in this area. Is going to make parkways, roadways, and the lack of walkways amplified. Okay, can we, whoever is controlling the slide, can we jump back to the opportunity sites and rezoning slide?
Sure.
For a moment. Thank you, JC. So one of the things that, that fair observation that there are a significant proportion of the units are proposed for Ward 1. There's a very specific reason for this, or a couple of specific reasons for this, I should say. And that is that Ward 1, particularly downtown Riverside, has some of the best transportation and access in the city. It's served by a multitude of public transportation lines, both rail and bus. So those things are significant factors in terms of prioritizing where we locate the potential opportunity sites for new housing. However, I do want to clarify, in the downtown area, as you see on this map there, it does appear that there are a lot of opportunity sites highlighted. Just a point of clarification on this map, downtown Riverside is a little bit different from other areas of the city in the way that it is zoned. And so we have to, when we want to allow potential housing development on a particular site, we are actually needing to change the allowable zoning for an entire district of the downtown area, which is why it kind of has the appearance of a large number of opportunity sites concentrated in a very small area, particularly around 14th and Market Street there. So that is kind of a quirk of the way that the zoning and the way that the mapping works. I don't want to create the impression that there's a huge concentration of opportunity sites that are focused right there in downtown. There's actually, a pretty equal distribution in terms of the number of sites across most of the wards. But you do bring up a good point that there are, a larger proportion of new units that are envisioned for Ward 1. Most of those are actually related to both the north side specific plan that I already mentioned in terms of zoning changes that were already adopted that allow for additional housing in that neighborhood, particularly that we are incorporating into our count. And then there are also some changes in what's called the Innovation District, which is a project that is under development by the economic development team with the city here that, and we're kind of teaming up with them to allow additional housing in some of the industrial area on the north of 3rd Street. So some of that has to do with the distribution of units as well. And then, okay, I think, yeah, I want to switch back now. I'm continuing the pattern of going back and forth to verbal comments. So we have a hand raised from Janet. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
sir. Okay, this is just a recommendation. It's just to ensure a robust conversation with major efforts to engage people in EJ communities, and also using the Cal Environment Screen to protect most vulnerable communities.
Okay, great, thank you. Actually, Deborah, can you share with us a little bit about how environmental justice communities are identified, what the requirements are, and what that process is like?
Sure. So we do use Cal EnviroScreen to identify those communities so that we can do the evaluation. So there is a bit of legwork that we're including as a part of this process, and utilizing various sources of data to identify, these communities within the city. So that is a major part of the task at hand, is to get an understanding of who these communities are, to engage them through these public meetings, and to get an understanding of their needs. And then there's also other tools, like California EPA also has something on their website. So there are a number of available tools, as well as available guidance that we will use. And then what we'll end up doing is taking all of that data and taking a look at what is the current general plan and developing policies that are specific to them, so that way we can address some of those concerns. So that's part of the overall project objectives.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, so next we have a question from Tom. Will there be an annual report of our goals to actual units built in the pipeline? Will there be a spot on the city website to monitor our RHNA progress? I'm happy to answer. The answer to both of those questions is yes. So in terms of annual reporting, we do have to report our progress to the state every single year in terms of how many units have been proposed, how many have been approved, how many have been built. There's a whole reporting process that we have to go through every single year. And so that will definitely be a part of the process. And we have received funding from the state. The city has received funding from the state to develop an online housing dashboard. So that's a project that we have not necessarily got underway yet, but we do have funding lined up to put out a request for proposals for someone to develop that for our website. So stay tuned for that. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Rose Mays, I do see your hand up again. I just want to confirm whether you have a comment or question. No? Okay, good. All right. So I don't have any more raised hands, so we'll start working through some of the written questions now. We have quite a few. I want to make sure we get to as many of them as possible. Next question from John: Are housing units strictly limited to the opportunity sites identified, or can other locations be added at a future date and still be covered by the EAR? Unfortunately, at this point in time, we have pretty much, we're kind of beyond the point where we can really add additional sites at this point in time. And that's because we've already started the process of developing a lot of the analyses that are really dependent on knowing the specific locations of the sites that we'll be rezoning in order to have the most complete and most accurate analysis that we can. Now, with that said, going back to something that I mentioned earlier, the opportunity sites that we've identified are not the only locations in the city where housing can be developed. They are just what we are looking at currently as good potential development opportunities, either that are already zoned for housing and we don't need to do anything to, we just include them on our list, or we are proposing to rezone to allow for housing where it's not currently allowed, or housing where more housing where less is currently allowed. So we have a question for Christopher. Are current and future property values considered in the EIR? Deborah, can you help us with this?
Sure. I actually just put in a response, so I just answered that electronically. So that is, I'm just trying to find it, but so that's actually not a CEQA issue. So the issue of property values is not a CEQA topic that requires evaluation. But as a part of the project, we are developing various types of housing. We're also addressing social equity issues to support positive economic outcomes. So that's a part of the overall goal for the project, even though we might not delve that deeply into whether property values will change as a result of the project.
Thank you, Deborah. All right. Next question is from Tom. Can you explain the process of how you evaluate impacts to city services, like public safety, utilities, including sewer, with city departments? Are there comments and reports included in the EIR? Deborah or Allison, can you help us with this?
Sure. So as a part of the analysis, we do evaluate what the full build out of the project is. So we take that number and we say, what is the population growth related to full build out? And we take in, generation factors as they relate to the project. We look at the existing capacities for the utilities that regulate those and the infrastructure that's available. We also look at future projections and funding that's available to accommodate that population growth. So we take a look at multiple factors related to those, and then we conduct the evaluation of what's the project's incremental impact to those services, and then we come up with our conclusions that way. So those evaluations will be in the draft EIR.
Great, thank you. Oh, can you just explain for us what generation factors are?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, we can look at something that says, okay, what is one person's use of energy, or what is their use of water typically? And so we'll take a look at, what would one person's contribution be, and then we add it to the total population growth. So that might be just a very simplified look at it. We might not look at everything in that way. It really depends on what the utilities are providing in terms of what their capacity is, but we look at multiple things. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide estimates of what is the project's contribution to those utilities. And we also take a look at them too by land use. So we don't necessarily always look at it by population, but we might look at them as these types of land uses produce this type of use for that utility. And so we'll have our conclusions in the draft EIR related to that.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Marvin. Will the VMT analysis include actual steps to minimize VMT instead of just dismissing it as unworkable? Again, I'll ask ICF to cover what some of the potential mitigation measures for VMT might be.
Well, we're currently working through the process of developing the analysis. So we have our land use data, we're taking that data and we're developing what the VMT contribution will be with the project implementation. So we're not at a point yet to have developed mitigation related to those topics. This is still very premature in our analysis. So we do want to find ways to not have impacts. So we want to be able to reduce them. So there are multiple ways we can do that. I just don't have the answer to that, but that's definitely something that will be found in the draft EIR when it's available.
Great, thank you. All right, next question is from MV. Can you please share explicit race-based environmental impacts, specifically housing located in areas of high pollution, like near freeways and bus stations? I am concerned about future housing developments impacting communities of color more than any other racial group. I would love to see data on high pollution areas in the city and where in relation new housing is being built. So what kinds of health impacts, air quality impacts will the project evaluate, and is there a way through the CEQA process to take a look at how there are differential impacts of those things across different races, or if not, what are some other things that we might be able to do?
So that question's for me. Or sorry.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Sorry.
Just making sure. That's a great question. So as a part of our EIR, we have a population and housing chapter. That chapter will provide a lot of demographic information to provide sort of the baseline for what the city population is. So it'll include information about, who the minorities are and, what percentage of the population are they, what types of housing are included, are there low income? So we'll provide a lot of that baseline data in our draft EIR. We'll also be evaluating, the overall impacts to communities in multiple sections of the EIR. So we'll be looking at what are the air quality impacts. We'll also be looking at, what are water impacts, what are greenhouse gas emission impacts. I'm trying to remember what other items you'd mentioned, but we're going to take a look at what are the potential impacts to the community with implementation of the proposed project. And so we'll be looking at all of those factors, and we'll be providing the analysis in the draft EIR.
One thing I want to add there is an important distinction to make in terms of impacts, as in a very specifically CEQA way, which is we have to look at the potential impacts of the project onto the environment, but we do not necessarily have to examine the potential impacts of the environment onto the project, with some exceptions and nuances to that. But because of that, that's an important reason why the policies piece of what we do here is important, because the policies piece can help us to address those impacts, potential impacts of the environment onto the project that maybe aren't necessarily fully covered by CEQA. So I know I keep hammering on this in all of the meetings that we do, but I do want to encourage you all to stay tuned very shortly here for a series of meetings and drafts and other information about the policies component to it, because it is a very important companion to the other things that we're doing as part of this project. So. Let's see, next question. I don't have any hands up, so I'm going to keep going down the written questions list. Let's see, how will the needed infrastructure, roads, water, power, hospital beds, and schools be paid for by developers or the current residents? Is the state looking at major public works projects, as the state does not have enough water storage capacity currently to combat drought? Okay. So there's a few different things here. One is, you mentioned paying for certain improvements by developers. So we do have currently established impact fees for certain things like parks, like transportation, that new development does need to pay for to offset. In addition to having to fund, any actual project-driven construction or improvements or infrastructure that may be, necessary to implement for a specific development project. There's also a more generalized, series of fees that go into kind of these collective pots to help pay for that. This is sort of a question that's a lot broader than the housing and public safety element updates that we're looking at. And I realize it's probably not a super adequate answer, but I do want to make sure that that this is really only phase one of our comprehensive general plan update, and we do have the opportunity coming up over the next few years here, as we begin phase two of the general plan update, where we are looking much more closely at things like infrastructure and public services, and what kinds of things we need to do as a city, what kind of policies we need to put in place, and what kind of actions we need to take in order to make sure that we are adequately providing for all of our current and our future residents. The city also can, this is quite separate from what we do with the city, but the city does also advocate at the state level for things like additional funding for the kinds of public works projects that you're talking about. So that is not lost on the city as an organization in terms of importance there. It just is, again, it's a lot broader than this particular project. Let's see here. Okay, no hands. To what extent does each of the alternatives rely on ADUs to meet the RHNA numbers? So I want to ask Veronica to help us understand how ADUs factor into our RHNA obligation. But first, I do want to mention that, ADUs are really only a small piece of our overall goals here. They are not necessarily part of the build out that we're examining through the EIR. And the reason for that is because ADUs do not require any zone change or anything like that, which is really the impacts that the EIR is analyzing are related to the zone changes that we're doing in order to accommodate our housing obligations. And ADUs are not necessarily a part of that package. So, but Veronica, can you help us with a little bit about understanding how ADUs factor into meeting our RHNA obligations?
Sure. We are certainly allowed to count some ADUs as part of our RHNA strategy, but because ADUs are something that is like controlled by like homeowners, it's not a development. This is not something that the city can zone for, just like Matthew was saying. So the way that we count ADUs is based on trends. The state laws specifically say that you have to come up with a historical trend between 2018 and 2020. Those are the new laws where ADUs become much more easier to develop. And so if you come up with a trend, and you can project the similar trend into the future. You can accelerate the trend if you're able to facilitate and incentivize the development of ADUs. Now, I don't know exactly the number we are using right now for the RHNA credits or for the RHNA strategy for Riverside, but just like Matthew mentioned, it's a very minute component of your overall strategy.
I can relate that the ADUs that we're projecting to be built over the 8-year planning period is less than 1,000. It's about 850 or so based on current trends and, applying some of the factors that Veronica was speaking about. So again, it's a really, really kind of a minor piece. It is still an important part of our strategy because it is, one way to encourage the kind of production of what might be called naturally occurring affordable housing, but it is not a huge driving force. So, okay, question on the large residential developments. This is from Tom. Happening on our border with the city of Colton. Will the EIR address this? RPO has some agreements with Colton on their developments. ICF team, can you talk a little bit about the cumulative impacts analysis that will be done?
Sure. So that is an inherent part of an EIR is that we look at what the project's contributions are in relation to other projects. So we'll take a look at what is going on, not just within the city, but we'll take a look at what's going on nearby and what could also contribute to impacts alongside the project. So development like that might be covered in other planning documents for adjacent jurisdictions that we'll be looking at. So we'll be evaluating the potential impacts of not just the project, but of other projects that could be going on that could also contribute to impacts in the city. So that will also be in the EIR when it's completed.
Great, thank you. All right, question from NV, how are green spaces being incorporated into housing development? Again, Black and Indigenous people of color deserve green spaces too, and I'd like to know how your plans will specifically speak to restorative nature measures within communities of color, which are greatly impacted by housing developments. So there's so a couple of different things here. One is, and less so related to CEQA, but one is that all new housing development does have minimum requirements for common and private open space that includes amenities like what you're speaking about on a project by project basis. Of course, what we're looking at is not related to specific development projects, but is more programmatic However, part of this process is going to involve updating our zoning regulations to adjust and address development standards for specific projects, like open spaces and amenities on a particular development project site. So that is a part of what we are looking at here. In terms of restorative nature measures, I would have to say there, that the EIR will analyze Parks and Recreation as a potential environmental impact area, and potentially develop some mitigation measures for addressing access to things like that in areas where those are challenges. I don't know if Deborah or Allison, you can talk a little bit more about what the Parks and Recreation component of the EIR analysis looks like.
We'll be taking a look at what existing recreational resources are available to communities in the city and whether or not there's any potential for any new development. But we're not going to get to that level of detail, but we will be also taking a look at, will implementation of the housing element result in any changes of capacity or any impacts to recreational facilities? So those are questions that are inherent in CEQA that we will address, and that's also an issue that the initial study said we would require further study in the draft EIR.
All right. No hands currently, so question from Taylor, echoing in D, for sites determined fit for housing development, is there a minimum distance threshold for walkability to green spaces and public transit? Good question. There's not necessarily a minimum threshold in terms of the analysis that we did to develop our sites inventory, but that was definitely one of the major factors that drove the identification of the opportunity sites that we have come up with. I don't believe we have them in this presentation, but if you've been present for any of our previous workshops or have reviewed the previous presentations that we've given, which are posted on the project's website, one of the things that we looked at in developing our analysis for identifying where sites might, where good sites might be located is, 5, 10, 15-minute walk sheds from things like community centers, libraries, parks, and also activity centers where there's shopping or there's employment or there's access to transportation. Importantly, transportation corridors and stops were a major driving factor too in identifying where things are located. So yeah, there you go. Tom asks, thank you, Veronica. You raised a good question. Will our reporting focus on how many units are market rate versus affordable? The short answer about this is yes. Perhaps Veronica can share a little bit with us about how the annual reporting requirements, help us keep track of our requirements in terms of affordability levels, as outlined in the RHNA allocation that we've been given.
Sure, and definitely all the units have to be tracked by income category, just like the RHNA, very low, low, moderate, and above moderate income. And really for very low and low income units, unless they're deed restricted, affordable units with public, some kind of funding to subsidize their affordability, we typically do not count any marketly built market rate housing being affordable to low income. So that's why the reason why the majority of the units that we built maybe would be counted towards the moderate and above moderate income. In City of Riverside, some of we counted to moderate income. Anything that's ownership related, we can only typically count it towards above moderate income. Regarding ADUs, we are allowed to count a certain percentage of them being assumed to be affordable. But again, just like Matthew said, it's a very minute portion of your overall RHNA, like 28,000 unit RHNA strategy is only 850 units, coming over. So in the future.
Great, thank you, Veronica. Okay, question from MV. When it comes to housing, it's important for buildings to include green measures such as community gardens, solar panels, energy saving resources. What can you do to show the green carbon footprint reduction necessary to satisfy our community needs since Riverside has historical pollution issues? Not related to this project, but I do want to point out or bring your attention to just today, the city's Economic Development Branding and Placemaking Committee had a discussion on exploring a decarbonization program. So that's going to be something to watch if that's an area of interest to you. In terms of energy, that is one of the areas that we do need to analyze and review under CEQA. So Deborah or Allison, can you talk a little bit about what things we have to examine for energy and whether there's any measures that we can apply or potentially be applied to help with those kinds of carbon reductions that the question asker references? Right, so the CEQA initial study that was prepared actually has the evaluation of energy in there. So we've looked at that issue and, you know, you can actually see the results of the analysis. So there are some, you know, talking points in there. I think it'd be really beneficial for you to take a look at that to see if you agree with those conclusions. But there are measures that will probably be included in the greenhouse gas analysis about ways to reduce you know, the carbon footprint. Those just haven't been developed yet. So we will be, you know, currently conducting our analysis based on the project that you heard today. And so those results are still pending. So, you know, be prepared to see those results when the analysis is ready in the summer. All right, thank you. We have a question that was submitted actually by email from Liz. Or a recommendation, mark on a map any sites in the city that are contaminated and ensure the proposed sites are not in proximity or have a proper buffer. Can you talk about hazards and hazardous materials analysis that will be done and the kinds of data that will be used to inform that analysis, Deborah? Sure. We'll be taking a look at hazards because it is a CEQA threshold question and it's an important one. So we will be evaluating the city's impacts to that. And then, you know what, I'll have Allison speak up too because she's currently leading that section and working through that and can provide a little more detail.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. We will be looking at all of the hazardous materials sites, the known areas of contamination, and whether they contain underground storage tanks or various land uses are at higher risk, such as gas stations, even dry cleaners, auto repair shops, those kinds of things. And we'll be comparing that to where we've identified the housing opportunities so that we can then determine whether putting housing there is going to result in an impact due to the existence of those hazardous sites. So those will be mapped and will be quite visible to disclose the impacts. Oh, I lost my screen. Just a second. Oh, there we go. Okay, let me get my questions back. Okay, how will you engage, a question from Envy, how will you engage EJ impacted communities, especially since Riverside's largest population is Latinx and Spanish speaking low-tech users? So an internal question, how are we reaching people that are hard to reach, especially with what's happened to us in the last year in terms of limiting our ability to do things, especially out in the world. One of the encouraging things I think for everybody that's happening right now is things are starting, knock on wood here, but things are really starting to improve in terms of the pandemic issues that we're facing, and we are potentially looking at a situation where we have opportunities to do more than we have previously. And so we've been looking at this since we heard these comments in previous meetings as well. So we are exploring a number of different measures that we can take. Some of them may be, things that we can already do within what we're working on in the project. Some of them may be something extra that we can do, but it may very well be that it is worth it to do that. This might include things like cooperating with some of our food distribution events, some of our working with our public libraries, including libraries that do toy learning, learning checkout, learning lending libraries and things like that. We have a network, developing network of community food pantries and little free libraries that we may be able to partner with in order to get more information out to folks. We can look at things like digital and analog radio ads in multiple languages, ads on public transportation, trying to, make people aware of the project. Just a few things that we've been looking at doing, utility bill inserts. Most people who live in the city receive a city utility bill. So that's one strategy that we can use to get to people, particularly low-tech households, to make them aware of what's happening with this project and invite them to share their input and their feedback with us. Another thing specifically related to CEQA that we will do is, we do have to publish physical copies of the document when it is ready for review, and provide those and distribute those throughout the city at various public locations where they can be accessed like libraries. So that's another thing that we can do. And of course, recommendations, we're always open to them as well. I know that it's been suggested before that, and maybe something that we can take a second look at now that we are advancing in terms of tiers for the California's Safer Recovery Plan, is meeting people at locations where they may already be, grocery stores and things like that. So that is more related to the other components of the project than it is the CEQA, although it is important to make sure that people are being involved in the CEQA review and environmental review process as well. So let's see. We are coming down on the end of our questions, just a few more here. Question from Tom, do you have dates for the policy review meetings? We're still confirming those, so I don't want to put them out there just yet in case they have to change, right? And so, but I do expect that in the next week or two, we will be announcing those formally and starting a push through multiple channels, including some of the things that I just mentioned, in terms of reaching, other communities and harder to reach groups of folks to start pushing that information out. So please do stay tuned for that. Another thing that I do want to mention, this is coming up very quickly, but we do want to get the word out in as many ways as possible, is that this project will be coming to the City Council's Housing and Homelessness Committee on May 3rd. So that is an opportunity, and the materials for that have been published now. I will actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link in the chat for everyone to see if you want to take a look at those materials. These include a first draft of housing and housing policies and actions and housing related environmental justice policies and actions. And it also includes some of our draft environmental justice policies as well. These are out. They are just drafts. We would love to hear your feedback on them. And we would also like to invite you to provide comments, call in, participate in the Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting that will be happening on May 3rd, on Monday, May 3rd, and that will be at 4 p.m. But in terms of the policy focus workshops, please stay tuned for a formal announcement of dates on those. Okay. Let's see, just a few questions remaining here. Question from MV, given that the policy is critical to actionable environmental justice items, can you speak to how you will be transparent about the demographics of those involved in developing said policy, especially community engagement?
So we will be providing a list of all of the community engagement activities. It's actually going to be a summary of everything that we have done, including all of the groups that we have met with as part of sort of the project documentation. And that's going to continue to evolve as we continue to go through this. So a big part of what we've been doing, in addition to having public meetings like this, is communicating with a large list of stakeholders and community groups and people who've indicated that they're interested in these kinds of activities on a regular basis. We're actually happy to make that list public to you now. If you'd like, we can share that with you. Providing regular communications, electronically to that list of stakeholders, and really kind of leaning on our community groups to help us get the word out as much as possible. We've been brought together with, so many different stakeholder groups through this process, including, labor, the chambers of commerce, anti-racist organizations, environmental justice focused organizations, individuals. And so there's, really been a wide range of people who've been, met with us and brought their perspective to it. We are asking people to provide policy recommendations, whatever they may have, to help us inform what we do in terms of developing the policies. I will say that what's been released for review for the Housing and Homelessness Committee, which is coming up, these, we kind of had to start somewhere. So these are drafts that were developed by the project team. And these were informed by sort of best practices based on, we do have specialists with the environmental team who are leading these various components: public safety, environmental justice, and housing. And also some of the statutory requirements. We do have some policies that we have to, our policies have to speak to certain things in order to meet the requirements of the law. So that's kind of our starting place. We've also been looking to the guidance of our city manager's office, and we'll be looking for council committee's advice, as well as a housing action team that has been assembled by the mayor's office. So just some of the avenues that we're drawing that from. We have just a couple of minutes left. I see JC popping back on to kind of shepherd us to that. So I will answer one last question from Tom. Oh, and don't let me forget to put the link to that meeting material in the chat. But while I do that, Tom asks, does the EIR include potential changes to our general plan or local specific plans? So the answer to that is yes. The EIR is looking at changes to, as Deborah mentioned earlier in the presentation, the general plan, the zoning ordinance and the zoning map, and 7 specific plans. And Deborah, I don't know if you, while I get this link put together, if you can let us know which specific plans are included in the EIR that will be amended.
Sure. Those specific plans will include the downtown, Magnolia Avenue, University Avenue, Riverside Marketplace, Canyon Springs Business Park, Hunter Business Park, and La Sierra University. So the project will evaluate some changes, mostly minor, but larger for the downtown specific plan. As a part of this update, some zoning change updates, as well as updates to the housing element and the public safety element. The other elements of the general plan will not be changing, so we will not be evaluating changes to those.
Right. One last question here. Can we please type the May 3rd information in the chat? That's been done. Please take a look at the chat for meeting information for that. That'll be a formal public meeting on the city's channel. So set channels, so Riverside TV, Legistar, EngageRiverside.com. Those are the channels through which you would tune in for that meeting, along with policy links and stakeholder lists you mentioned. So the draft policies are also in that May 3rd meeting link. So take a look there. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, I can share stakeholder lists with you there. So go ahead and feel free to reach out to me directly for that. We could actually have the next slide, please, just as a reminder. Here is all of our contact information and how to access more information about the project website and maps and things of that nature. So if you want to learn more, please make note of these things here. And again, just a note about the downloadable PDF map. We realize that link is broken. We will be fixing that. So I want to take a moment to thank everybody who's participated in this. I know this was a long meeting. It's a lot of information. It's really important to us to make sure we hear these things from you. This will help us to make sure that our environmental document that we develop addresses everything that it needs to address and is adequately evaluating all of our potential environmental impacts. So with that, I want to say thank you very much, everyone, for your time tonight. We hope to continue to hear from you. If we did not get to your questions in the time allotted, I do apologize, but we are making a list of all of the questions that are received, and we'll try to make sure that we address those going forward. And if not, you are always welcome to reach out to me directly with anything. So thank you again for your time, and everyone, please have a good night.